Greetings, all you beautiful viewers at home or out and about. It's the month of March again, at least at the time of uploading this, I hope. Which means that it's time for a yearly tradition of sorts on this channel. For those who might be new here, let me give you a quick summary. I like to dedicate the month of March to exploring topics related to Ireland and its bountiful folklore. But despite my choice of words there, Irish paganism and folklore aren't all too commonly explored in the medium of video games, especially in comparison to something like Nordic, Greco-Roman, or Japanese sources. But given how Ireland tends to be on most people's minds because of St. Patrick's Day on the 17th, I'd like to think that it's still festive to use the occasion to talk about instances where video games actually do incorporate Irish legends in detail. However, there was a bit of a problem getting this video prepared. Aside from missing a video for March last year, I had a run-in with Idea Block and spent both January and February without any particularly solid new ideas. I could always go back to Type Moon's Fate franchise, since it offers some of the most detailed portrayals of Irish legends, but I've already done that twice, and quite frankly, I've burned myself out on Fate for a fair while longer. But then, a bout of sudden inspiration hit me while I was watching a playthrough of Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. Towards the end of the game, in the arena section of Dracula's castle, there's a boss named Balor, already drawing directly from Irish folklore, and I could quickly tell from his boss battle that he was close to the mythos. Certainly enough to warrant an appearance on this show. Not only that, but I found out that 1, Balor has been a recurring boss in the Castlevania series, and 2, that there have also been regular enemies based on the historical Balor's people, the Fomorians. While the Dullahan is without a doubt my favorite creature from the old stories of the Emerald Isle, the Fomori would absolutely be my second favorites, and I'm excited to finally have an outlet to talk about them, even if this might not be as long or super in-depth as other recent topics. The explanation will probably go on longer than the comparisons to Castlevania, but this wouldn't be the first time that's happened here. I have an opportunity, and in the end, that's what matters most. I'm the Kitsune Hawk, and today we'll be taking a look at how the Castlevania franchise has interpreted the fearsome Fomori of Irish folklore, both as bosses and as regular enemies. So get out your pencils, trivia enthusiasts, because this is character development. So as far as Balor and the Fomor enemies go, they're part of the Metroidvania or Koji Igarashi era of Castlevania, so we'll be discussing a few of the series entries on the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. These games aren't exactly super familiar to me, as I've always been more of a pre-Symphony of the Night kind of Castlevania fan, so I apologize if I end up making some minor errors here. But of course, before we can start talking about Castlevania's interpretations, I need to go over the mythos of the Fomorians, including their recurring role in the legends of Old Hibernia. So let's jump right into the meat of the matter then. The Fomori, or Fomorians, either term is acceptable, are a race of non-human beings mentioned several times in Irish folklore, though some of the details surrounding them are more consistent than others. Much of this can be chalked up to the purposeful alteration and/or poor preservation of Irish pagan legends at the hands of Christian scribes. One of the main sources of Fomorian lore is the Book of Invasions, an 11th century compilation which sought to organize various folktales and historical records into a single, cohesive historical narrative telling the early history of Ireland. Unfortunately, yet also expectedly, this narrative involves some rather messy blending of Irish paganism with stories and characters from the Bible, though it also provided a very influential model for understanding the island's origin stories, the idea of the Six Invasions. According to the model of the Six Invasions, the human settlement of Ireland, as well as the foundations of Irish culture, occurred through the successive arrival of 6 different populations. The Fomorians, however, were already living on the island by the time the first invasion occurred, having originally come from somewhere beneath the ocean, and they often terrorized their new and unwanted neighbors. They fought against the followers of Partholon, who led the second invasion, fought, captured, and enslaved the followers of Nemed, who led the third invasion, and engaged in several battles with the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the fifth invasion. At the same time, however, the Tuatha De had a very complicated relationship with the Fomori. The two groups killed each other for control of Ireland, and the Fomorians forced the Tuatha De Danann into acts of tribute that bordered on slavery, but they also married and produced children together. All-out war between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomori broke out after the former group had subdued the Fir Bolg, who led the fourth invasion, and evicted an unpopular half-Fomori king, Bresh, from their leadership. Anything but happy to be ejected from power, Bresh appealed to his Fomorian kinsfolk by asking for a war, and what ensued would become the final major conflict between the Fomori and the Tuatha De. So you can best bet that the story gets especially exciting and dramatic here. Among the Fomori at this point in the myth was their reigning king, a titan of fearsome strength named Balor, who had a special eye that, once opened, unleashed total destruction upon everything in its gaze. Some versions ascribe a venomous or petrifying quality to it, though the most common interpretation is that it set the land and everything on it ablaze. Stepping up to the plate to fight Balor was Luch, a warrior and master craftsman among the Tuatha De Danann, as well as the giant's grandson for that added twist of drama. Using a stone and a sling, Luch struck Balor's eye so hard that it went to the back of his head, setting the Fomorian army on fire before Balor collapsed in death. Other versions state that Luch hurled a red spear into Balor's eye, killing him instantly. But regardless of the details, the message is the same. Balor's greatest weapon was also his greatest weakness. The Second Battle of Moytura ended soon after the death of Balor, and it was the greatest defeat for the Fomori. Most of the survivors were promptly rounded up and forced into the ocean. From the sea they came, and to the sea they would leave. But that doesn't mean that they were completely gone. Indeed, tales set in later times, including the legends of Cuchulainn, himself a descendant of Luch, mention the continued existence of Fomorians in Ireland, albeit with greatly reduced prominence. The term Fomorian even became synonymous with sea raiders, as if their descendants became vengeful pirates, scouring the waters and adjacent coasts. Descriptions of the Fomori are just as varied as their roles. Many tales emphasize their appearance as strikingly grotesque, sometimes as giants with asymmetrically deformed bodies, sometimes as giants with only one eye, one arm, and one leg, and sometimes as creatures with mixed human and animal, typically goat, anatomy. At the same time, however, there are also tales that describe the Fomori as darkly beautiful, especially in the case of halflings born from the intermarriage of Fomorian and Tuatha De Danann. This conflict in consistent descriptions might be a byproduct of cultural exchange between the Irish Gaels and the outside world. It's possible that the Fomorians were influenced by stories from seafaring peoples who made prior contact with the Irish, such as the Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, and early Norse. Comparisons have been drawn between the Fomorians and the Vanir and Jotnar of the Nordic Germanic religion, as well as the giants and cyclopes of the Greco-Roman religion. And the slaying of Balor in particular sounds notably similar to the biblical duel of David and Goliath. Biblical interpretations, both medieval and beyond, have also theorized that the Fomorians were the possible progeny of Cain, the first murderer who was condemned to wander the world, or otherwise the progeny of Ham, the forsaken son of Noah whose bloodline was cursed. However they got here, they've since become a prominent inclusion of Irish folklore over the centuries. So with that mouthful of exposition now done and established, let's get back to Castlevania. But instead of starting with Balor, let's instead start with the Fomor enemies, which appear in Castlevania Order of Ecclesia on the Nintendo DS. These come in two varieties: the Black Fomor, found along the Misty Forest Road, and the White Fomor, found in the Mystery Manor and the library of Dracula's Castle. It might have been just a little more fitting to have them appear closer to the water, given the legend's abyssal origins, But for all I know, these could be like the original variety of Fomorians, or the stragglers from the end of the story. Most likely, though, is that I'm reading way too much into the enemy placement. Anyways, getting back on track, these enemies have a very distinct human and goat hybrid look, not unlike the more famous image of Baphomet or other similar demons, even casting glyph incantations as their method of attack. But as far as their physical appearance goes, it happens to be shared with one of those aforementioned interpretations of the Fomorians, mentioned within the Book of the Dun Cow, a manuscript from the early 12th century. Of course, it's also likely that this portrayal was already influenced by the beastly images of medieval Christian devils, since it wasn't uncommon for entities and creatures of pagan origin to be equated with demons. They don't really do much else though, given that they're just plain old fodder enemies instead of bosses or characters of story importance, like other episode subjects for the show. But at the very least, it's neat to know that they might have been influenced by a particular version of the Fomorians. A bit of newfound appreciation to end on. So then, let us now move on to the giant who provoked this episode, Balor. That's, Balor with an E, just to be clear. Rather than being broadly based on the Fomori as a whole, he's clearly inspired by their most famous leader, the colossal king with the baleful eye. And can I just say that I love the visual illusion going on here. Probably due to the technical limitations of the Game Boy Advance, we can only see Balor's face and forearms, while the darkness obscuring everything gives Balor the extra menacing appearance of a giant sealed away in an underground cage. Just imagine what kind of havoc he could bring if he were freed. Balor's fight has two phases of sorts, in which he focuses on two different methods of attack. For the first half, he uses his fists, with one of his eyes closed for the duration. After taking enough damage, Balor will open his other eye and, just like the Irish legends, it will bring destruction to everything in its sight, setting the ground on fire. At the same time, though, you'll need to weave around the attacks to strike Balor's baleful eye and finish him off. It's short and sweet, but I really admire how it plays out like the legendary duel between Balor and Luch as best as it can. A bit disappointing that Balor's soul gives you his punch attack instead of the eye beam, but that was the developer's preference between the two, so at least it was considered. Moving forward, Balor would reappear in both Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow and Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, both on the Nintendo DS. But from this point on, his appearance was significantly altered. Rather than being a tan-skinned giant inside a dark cage, Balor is now a bluish-green color, we can see most of the upper half of his body, and his head is covered by a metal brace of some sort. Definitely looking more like the monstrous imaginings of the Fomorians. He retains his characteristic baleful eye of destruction, but rather than setting everything in its gaze on fire, it's a large, almost screen-filling laser instead. Considering that Dawn of Sorrow is a sequel to Aria of Sorrow, maybe this is meant to be a sort of zombified or decaying version of Balor, having become scarred and weaker since his initial defeat. Like seriously, the guy got demoted from being a later game boss in Aria of Sorrow to being one of the first bosses in Dawn of Sorrow. And if I'm being totally honest, his redesign's kind of a downgrade in my eyes, if you'll pardon the pun. But I suppose what matters most is that each of Balor's boss fights offers a subtle but still accurate portrayal of the giant and his Eye of Devastation, though I'd personally rank Aria of Sorrow's version over the shared redesign in Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin. And with that, we've more or less gone over everything there is to cover with Castlevania's take on the Fomorians. At least for now, unless some miracle happens and they show up again in another Castlevania game in some way, shape, or form. Do pardon my probably visible excitement at the topic, as well as the shorter length of discussion this time around. Like I mentioned toward the beginning of the video, in the realm of creatures from Irish legend, the Fomori are another favorite of mine, especially for the air of mystery around them. I can't say I can think of very many video games that have used the Fomori as a story element, at least off the top of my head, So seeing Castlevania Showcase 2, debatably 3 different portrayals of the Fomori, makes me quite happy. Even though Balor is a boss that doesn't have much significant plot relevance in any of his appearances, and even though the Fomor are just regular enemies that you can otherwise ignore and forget about, their presence and attention to detail is still something that you can sit back and appreciate. Stop and smell the monstrously deformed abyssal roses, you know? And for the prospective video game developers and writers who might be watching, the Fomori provide quite a bit of lucrative potential to work with. Why did they come to Ireland in the first place? What happened to the main population after they were banished back to the ocean? What if they look like hybrids of humans and deep-sea aquatic life? Could you tie them to something like the works of H.P. Lovecraft? With any luck, this won't be the last time I get to talk about the Fomori, and I hope I can address one of these questions if there is indeed another occasion. Keep your eyes peeled though, as I'm not done talking about the Book of Invasions just yet. If things work out, there's another topic I'd like to explore that involves the epilogue of the Tuatha De Danann, one that starts to sound somewhat similar to the fate of the Fomori.